Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. If you recognize those notes, you're among a multitude. That's the theme song of one of the most loved wildlife TV programs, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. The show, which debuted 60 years ago, enraptured viewers with its adventures, won multiple Emmy Awards, and inspired a generation of conservationists and scientists. Nearly 34 million Americans tuned into the show each Sunday over its 25-year run on NBC. Since the show's end in 1988, it's gone through several iterations on various channels, and its newest version has made a much-welcomed comeback on NBC as Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, Protecting the Wild. Here to talk with us about Wild Kingdom past and present, we have two guests who've experienced it all in unique ways. First, we have Peter Gros. Peter co-hosted Wild Kingdom alongside original host and St. Louis Zoo director Marlin Perkins. He's also a co-host of today's Wild Kingdom. Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Very nice to talk to you.
And we also have Marguerite Garrick, daughter of Marlin Perkins. She lives in St. Louis and had very close-up and personal views of her legendary father's work and its continuing legacy. Marguerite, welcome to you as well.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you both for joining St. Louis on the Air. Now, Peter, you used to watch the show as a young kid every weekend. What impact did the show have on you? And did you ever imagine you would be co-hosting Wild Kingdom?
Well, no, not in a million years. I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by lakes and rivers and lots of country and nature to begin with. Excuse me. And then to be able to see Marlin Perkins taking me to places all around the world about wildlife that I knew I might not ever get to see did really inspire me and pique my interest and become more concerned about conservation of animals around the world.
Mm-hmm. And how was it that you began as a co-host?
Well, it's interesting. I was involved with American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and there was an ISIS program that dealt with the preservation of animals that were on the endangered species list. And the facility with which I was involved, we were breeding endangered cats at the time. And we happened to have the world's largest litter of tiger cubs born. Mm-hmm. And since it was such a large litter and the mother was unable to take care of them all immediately, I was able to rotate the cubs, so to speak, so they could get the necessary colostrum. And I had a call from Jim Fowler, who was on Wild Kingdom at the time when he'd heard about this litter of cubs. And sadly, at the time, Mr. Perkins was experiencing some illness, and he said, we're looking for someone to help us co-host the show, not necessarily an actor, but a wildlife expert, and would I be interested? And I thought for about 3 seconds and said, yes, let's talk.
Wow. So that led to a very fruitful career, obviously. Now, Marguerite, you also watched the show as a young kid, often with your dad and your family around you. What was that like?
Well, let me say that when my dad would come home from filming, he would want to know what was going on in our lives. You know, how'd I do on the math test, things like that. And he really wouldn't talk too much about his adventures, except occasionally he'd say, oh, I learned this interesting thing. If you're in a group of tiger sharks in a feeding frenzy and one comes toward you, if you hit it really hard on the nose with your flashlight, it will leave you alone.
Okay.
And that would be a fork clattering moment at the dinner table. but it was, all sitting there together. It didn't make it any less scary when he was on the air doing kind of life-threatening things like wrestling an anaconda.
Yeah.
So it was funny, he was sitting right there.
And yet that drama was still...
We were scared to death that he was going to get killed.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful watching it. It was such a good program, and always such a treat, too. I loved watching it, too.
Mm-hmm. Now, your father was born in Carthage, Missouri, and he worked at St. Louis Zoo as a young adult and then later became its director in 1962. And as the host of one of the earliest and most popular wildlife shows, Marlin, your father was really a legend in the nature adventure genre. What do you think it was about your father, Marguerite, that made him so beloved as a host?
I think it was that he was just playing himself, that he was a born communicator and educator, and that he was able to instill, I think that's the right word, his enthusiasm and boundless curiosity and respect for wildlife, across the airwaves and or send it across the airwaves. And people got it, and people thought they knew him. And I think Peter is now going to have this experience because he is also playing himself.
Right.
Honestly, I've seen the first show, and it's fabulous.
Mm-hmm. Now, Peter, you were with Marlin for a year before he retired on account of his health, which is something you mentioned earlier. And you also spent a few more years working with Jim Fowler, Marlin's co-host. What was it that you learned from them about conservation that you carry with you, that is, as a host? And was that gentle enthusiasm that Marguerite talked about part of that?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I remember most clearly about Marlin Perkins was that no matter where he was always interested in you. He was interested in your culture. He was interested in the area that he happened to be filming. He was incredibly interested to learn about the conservationists who were working there and the biologists that were studying wildlife there, as was Jim Fowler. They were both such amazing leaders for me as I began to learn about wildlife around the world, and we would go to film it. So they set wonderful examples for me about sharing wildlife information, doing as much homework as possible before we go to locations to film, talk to the researchers and the field biologists and learn absolutely as much. So when you share your information, it is accurate and stimulating, and hopefully it will inspire the next generation to want to do what they can do to help to preserve the natural world. Mm-hmm. But so often, I remember the very first show I did with Jim Fowler. We were going to Grand Chenier, Louisiana, where the alligator population was actually doing quite well. That was the year they came off the endangered species list in 1985. Mm-hmm. And they were hatching out about 20,000 eggs a year. Wow. And then reintroducing them. And Jim casually said to me, as he handed me sort of a miner's-like thing that goes on your head, when we go out to tag these and catch them and go with the biologists, we'll be catching them at night. He had forgotten to mention that to me with a big smile and this deep laugh that he always had. So as we worked with the Department of Fish and Game and captured and tagged and released and studied alligators, it was not only a learning curve about the correct manner in which to reach down in the water to collect a small alligator, but to time your breathing, because with the lights on to film at night, if you took too deep of a breath, you immediately had a mouthful of mosquitoes.
Oh.
So there's a lot of a learning curve that has to do with telling these kinds of wildlife stories, and then at the end being sure the information that we're disseminating to the public is accurate, inspiring, and now I think that we create hope, that we show as many successful conservation stories as we can, and also acknowledging the fact that we have what seems sometimes like insurmountable problems that can be solved as well.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Peter Gros, who co-hosted Wild Kingdom alongside original host and St. Louis Zoo director Marlin Perkins, and he is a co-host of today's Wild Kingdom. We're also speaking with Marguerite Garrick, daughter of Marlin Perkins. I want to talk more about Marlin and the show's legacy. Here's a clip from Memorable Moments in the Wild Kingdom, which was the last episode Marlin was in before he retired in 1985. He and Jim Fowler were reminiscing about some of the show's key moments, and Marlin ends with this reflection.
Today, we have brought you just a few of the many memorable moments Jim and I have shared in our years together.
Some were funny in the extreme, some very exciting, and some uncommonly interesting from the standpoint of scientific research.
Nature, as we have experienced it over these years, has been a treasure chest of wonders. And if we protect our natural heritage, there will always be memorable moments in the Wild Kingdom.
So, Marguerite, on that note of saving and conservation, you serve as a board member at the Endangered Wolf Center in Eureka, Missouri, which is a leading conservation organization that your father, Marlin, and Carol Perkins, your mother, founded. How did your father impact conservation efforts in the St. Louis area broadly, and then even far beyond that?
He was retiring from the zoo, from his zoo career, and had been worried about the plight of wolves in North America, in the lower 48 states, for years and years and years, because they were being exterminated. They were two remnant species of North American wolves still in the lower 48, besides Minnesota and Wisconsin. And they were the Mexican gray wolf and the red wolf, which is the wolf that was once in Missouri. So those two species of wolves were the focus at the founding of the Endangered Wolf Center, which took a very bold and unique approach by getting in cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state fish and wildlife agencies the permission to collect all of the remaining Mexican gray wolves in the wild and bring them into a careful captive breeding program. And because he did that, and all of the partners worked together, Mexican gray wolves did not go extinct, which they would have done quite certainly in the next several years.
Now, Marlin and Jim were both legendary zoologists and had such vast experience in conservation and ecology work. Marguerite, how does the new iteration of Wild Kingdom honor that and keep their legacy going? Peter referred a little bit to that earlier, but what is your view on that?
I love that it's protecting the wild, stories about hope, which is what we need. When the show first started out, it was when conservation research was at its peak. It's still, of course, going on, but a lot of the shows were about research efforts to try to protect animals. Well, this program is about that, too. And they do it beautifully. And I was told by the producer of the show, and Peter, I think this is right, that all of the programs this season are being made in places where my dad filmed Wild Kingdom programs. So that is showing that the conservation efforts have been continuing and have achieved some success.
Mm-hmm. Peter,
You're
go ahead.
Correct about that, and I think one of the highlights for our new series, which of Omaha's Wild Kingdom Protecting the Wild, is that we have returned to places like the an island where in 1977 Marlin Perkins was talking about reintroduction to puffins, which I think is one of the cutest birds in the world,
Agreed.
to this small rocky island where they hadn't been since the 1800s. We were there this year filming, landed in the exact same place where he did, walked along the island, and our story is about the success of that reintroduction program, how well the puffins are doing, the population is strong, they're returning every year to lay eggs and hatch out their end. So it's sort of a continuum of a story that he started telling in the 70s that we get to share with people that, yes, indeed, it's successful.
And Peter, why do you think, from your perspective as someone who is not a performer brought on to be a host, but someone who is involved in conservation work and work with animals, that it's so important in this time for these success stories to be shared?
Well, I think it's important because so much of what we hear can be talking about the gloom and doom, the state of our planet and all the problems that we have. And I'm certainly not saying we don't have a lot of problems, but I think it's important that we point out that we did used to. I remember in the center of our country when the rivers were so polluted they would catch fire, and numbers of species were on the brink of disappearing. The wolves that we talked about earlier were the portrait of the big bad wolf, and they were almost completely wiped off the face of our planet. I think that we need to show this current generation and hopefully inspire them that, yes, indeed, we are facing some gloom and doom, and we are facing serious problems, but we have a history of solving serious problems when we get on board, work together to solve them, and our planet is resilient. And I think with help from conservationists and every one of us at the local level, county level, state level, and eventually national level can make a difference to help preserve this wonderful natural world that we have.
Mm-hmm. And Marguerite, you were talking earlier about seeing a premiere. What most excites you about this reboot of the show and its return to NBC?
Well, carrying along with what Peter was just saying, which is so spot on, it's wonderful to have a program that you feel good about when you watch it, because it's telling you that here's something that is working, and these animals are being cared for and saved. And it's wonderful to have the chemistry between Peter and his co-host, Dr. Raywin Grant, is infectious. Their enthusiasm and the knowledge that they bring to the show is also just first rate. And I think that this show, as we said earlier, is going to go on to inspire new generations of people. My whole life, even to today, people come up to me and say, I became a zoologist because of your dad, or a veterinarian, or a volunteer at a conservation organization. And I think this happens to Peter too, and it will be happening even more. And that is a really important role to play, to get kids today very interested in science and research and biology and conservation.
Mm-hmm. And just in this last minute, from each of you, without giving anything away, is there something about the episode that was filmed earlier this summer at the St. Louis Zoo that you think people should definitely not miss?
Well, I think there's so much at St. Louis Zoo that people should visit, but I think the success, they are the Ozark hellbender that I mentioned. To see them, we stood in this river, Dr. Ray Grant and I stood in this spring-fed, very cold river, and literally gently lowered these hellbenders into the river and then dropped down with our snorkel and mask. These are animals that had never been in a wild river before and immediately knew exactly what to do to face the current, They have sort of a flat head and beady eyes. The head fits perfectly under rock, and they face upstream where the crustaceans might be coming by, and they already knew exactly what to do to exist back in a wild river. That is a part of the show that is just exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And this species was rescued from extinction through the work of the St. Louis Zoo at the Ron and Karen Gelmer Center. And let me just mention that the hellbender is a giant salamander.
Yes.
In case you were wondering.
We now have a visual to go with that, and we'll be looking forward to seeing that episode. Peter Gros is Wild Kingdom co-host and one of the original hosts of Wild Kingdom on NBC, which is now making a return. And Marguerite Garrick is daughter of Marlin Perkins. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
It was such a
Thank you.
You can watch Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, Protecting the Wild, Saturdays on Channel 5 at 10 a.m. The episode shot in St. Louis airs on November 25th.
Today's segment was produced by Aula Kuzic.
With audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.